Good evening. Welcome. My name is Christy Everett with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know with the forecast this week and all the rain we got yesterday, people were a bit panicked about rain today. The sun came out maybe because of the talk on solar. So we had some alignment there. I think we might get a little bit of a storm tonight. Really appreciate you being here. Just a few housekeeping items. This is being recorded. It's on Facebook, so don't jump in front of the camera if you're nervous about that for any reason, but mostly it'll be focusing on the presenter and the slides. And our composting toilets or bathrooms are just around to the left, so feel free to use those as needed. And you've been warned they're composting, not typical flush toilets. But really, really excited that you're here and took the time out to hear these speakers. These are excellent speakers, and I think we'll be touching on some broader policy implications that affect all of Virginia, all of the Commonwealth, and also we'll have a local impact and hopefully be able to affect our communities. So I think it's a great conversation. You will see some of the, one of the slides has a QR code for questions. We built in time for questions, so please do ask your questions online via that QR code. Thank you to our sponsors, Planetary Technologies, CMA CGM, and Cox Communications. Really appreciate the support in making this possible. I will dive right in. We've got three fantastic speakers, and want to set the stage to have Jay Ford be our first speaker. Jay is the Virginia Policy Manager at Chesapeake Bay Foundation, works with CBF staff throughout the Commonwealth to advance CBF's clean water initiatives, brings extensive experience in natural resource policy, contributing not only to the safeguard of Virginia's communities and natural resources, but specifically spent a lot of time this past year working on solar work groups as well. So knows this issue inside and out, and will be an excellent person to give us a little sense of the lay of the land, so to speak. So without further ado, I'll ask Jay to come up and start our program.
Okay. So much. Well, good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me? Good? All right. If we get bad sound at any point, just wave your hands at me and we'll figure it out. As Christy said, my name's Jay Ford. I'm our Virginia Policy Manager, and I had the dubious honor of being on 3 work groups to look at solar siting issues over the last 12 months of my life. Why do we need 3 work groups on this? That is because really what this slide is saying is we have a good problem on our hand. I come out of state government, so I am old enough to remember when we talked about things like the Clean Economy Act or a renewable portfolio standard, and members of the General Assembly would openly laugh in your face. When I worked in the state Senate, we would bring legislation each year through our office to implement a renewable portfolio standard for Virginia, and that bill would never even get a hearing, 3 years running. And we picked that up from another member that had gone on to Congress. It was just an annual ritual we like to do, with running into the brick wall in the General Assembly building. So when I view issues around solar siting in particular, it's a great problem to have, because 10, 15 years ago, we really couldn't imagine a Commonwealth where we had set a hard target and said, we're going to decarbonize in Virginia, and we are going to accelerate towards green energy, and we're going to do so really aggressively. And so now, as we're working through, where are we going to put it? What order are these different renewable energies going to come online? Those are great problems to work through, because we are solving a major environmental issue for the state, getting ourselves into a much better posture with sustainable energy. And so if we have to have 3 work groups to talk about where we're going to put it, I'm more than happy to participate, because it means we've made some really tremendous progress. So what I'm going to touch on very briefly is sort of set the table for what solar siting challenges have popped up from localities and other stakeholders, what some of the potential solutions are to address those, and then you're going to hear from some excellent other speakers who will talk a little bit more about big picture energy in Virginia, as well as some local examples about transitioning to solar. So, first of all, why is CBF involved? We get this question a lot, and I tell them without reservation, moving to clean energy is a Bay issue. And I don't mean that in like this very amorphous, detached way, like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon to get us to the Bay. It's a one-to-one relationship. And that is because what happens through fossil fuel production gets deposited into our waterways. When we look at Bay totals of nitrogen in the Bay, somewhere between 8 and 12% of all of the nitrogen in the Bay is coming from air deposition. That's huge. That's bigger than if we rolled up all of our, big polluters in the state and put them in a category. And they still wouldn't be in the same category as what we're getting from fossil fuel combustion dropping into our waters. Part of that is because we have a huge airshed. It goes all the way out to Ohio. Everyone that's burning fossil fuels anywhere in there, there's a likelihood that it's making its way to the Bay. But the other part of that is that they don't really think about nitrogen. We think about things that are going to really hurt public health. So nitrogen is raining down. And so anything to transition us to away from fossil fuel combustion in energy production is a one-to-one benefit for Bay restoration. Additionally, we have questions, or there have been longstanding issues with coal ash and waste disposal, putting pollutants into creeks around the state. There are air quality and environmental justice concerns with where we've cited a lot of these facilities. And then there's these bigger picture climate change impacts. And we at CBF feel very strongly that we are on the front lines, particularly right where we're sitting in terms of climate change impacts. So if we are going to be responding to these, you have to lead by example when we're asking the rest of the world to start curbing their fossil fuel emissions. And so Virginia has to lead the way. So there's a lot of reasons that we're involved, but the top one is that it directly impacts the waters. So where is Chesapeake Bay solar development? As of 2021, there was 958 solar arrays. This number is closer to 1,200 at this point, covering 12,000 acres built primarily on previously cultivated land, so land that was primarily agriculture. Maryland and Virginia are expanding the most rapidly in the Bay watershed, specifically Virginia. Virginia DEQ, as of earlier this year, projected 123,000 acres under panel by 2045. To put that in perspective, the city of Norfolk is 42,200 acres. So about 4 Norfolks is what we're looking at that by 2045. Let me put the additional caveat though. Norfolk's not a big city in landmass, so I don't want it to sound like it's too large. I just want to give you a frame of reference. The dominant land use that they've replaced has been these cultivated areas, so agricultural fields, pasture, timberlands, and by and large have avoided more natural land cover like hardwood forests and wetlands. There has been some what we call Core 1 forest build out in the DEQ analysis, and those are things that we try to move away from. But agriculture was the most frequently converted land use. So throughout all the last couple of years, there has been some pushback as Virginia has tried to move towards deploying solar. There are a number of things that we have heard from localities, from folks in the farming community, or just neighbors. Some of these are really key to CBF, so we really perk up when someone brings up issues around water quality or long-term land conservation. There's been a lot of misinformation, but there's also been there hasn't been a lot of resources to the localities that are being asked to put these projects in. So things like lack of planning and process, this came up a lot as we talked to stakeholders around Virginia. So, make sure I didn't skip. So one of this last year, as a result of many of those stakeholder concerns that were raised, there was a robust conversation about solar siting reform in Virginia, and in sort of a direct response to what we had heard, there were a couple of legislative vehicles that considered these two big principles. One is regional planning. Right now, localities feel like the solar development process is sort of ad hoc. Someone shows up, they pitch you a project, you don't know how it fits into the larger grid, you don't know what your transmission lines look like, and you don't know if this is the first project or if there's going to be multiple projects. So people had a big question mark on what does meeting our VCEA goals look like across the state of Virginia. Regional planning is something that's been really effective in a number of sectors throughout the state, so it was a good place for us to start. The other thing we heard from localities was these projects are really complicated. We don't know how to evaluate whether or not it's a good project. We don't know whether or not we should be asking for something different because this is a new technology. So the idea of advisory services, setting up a panel of technical expertise that localities could turn to say, help us understand this. Many localities that are being asked to accept solar projects right now have a part-time planner, if they have that. And so there was a real technical capacity question. So these were two of the potential solutions that were floated this year to help accelerate solar deployment. They did not make it out of the General Assembly, but both of these concepts have since found fertile ground in other venues. We recently saw comments from the State Corporation Commission where they recommended some type of regional planning because there wasn't consistent, they hadn't given a lot of thought to how potential projects were going to fit into the grid and transmission. So these are ideas that have been bubbling up in many sectors. Additional ideas for accelerating solar deployment that have come up over the last year or two is for trying to incentivize siting on previously disturbed lands. In Virginia code, that's anything that we've done something on. So it's not just like a super degraded land, it's a big box store, it's a parking lot. The previously disturbed land is any place that we've done something. And right now we are really struggling to find a way to accelerate that deployment on those previously disturbed soils. So people have floated a lot of different ideas around incentive programs or zoning changes. We saw legislation this year that really focused on parking lot solar. Unfortunately, it did not make it out, but we are hopeful that's going to come back next year. There was a big effort around mitigating when solar is located on prime agricultural soils or forest lands. That process has continued, got to a final rule, a place that we're all very comfortable with. So people, when they're building on a prime ag land or forest, they will have to acquire land or pay into a fund elsewhere to make sure that we are locking up prime land in addition to the land they're building on. And then an area that I think is really, we were really just scratching the surface is the idea of agrivoltaics. And Virginia has not really taken meaningful legislative action on this. We're behind where a lot of other states have moved so far, where they have looked at incentive programs, at codifying a definition for by right solar for farmers that want to produce a crop while also being able to install a solar farm on their property. And when you look around the world, there's some really innovative stuff happening. What you see on the slide here is folks growing shade, crops that need shade under the solar panels. Makes a lot of sense. I don't know why this didn't occur to us earlier, but it has taken, this model has been very successful in China. They're growing a lot of cut flowers. They're growing some fruit crops, and they're doing it all under their energy production. And I think that's pretty incredible and something that Virginia needs to continue to take a harder look at. We've had some missteps in our foray into agrivoltaics. Have one project where I live where we were supposed to have sheep everywhere, and I've yet to see a sheep under said panel. So people are now pretty understandably annoyed that they were sold a bill of goods that didn't come to pass. But part of that is because ownership of these properties changes a lot, and so the contracts don't always continue on, and that's one of the things that we want to look at in trying to incentivize agrivoltaics. Just a real quick map. This was produced by our friends at the Nature Conservancy. It shows the blue are those lands that are good lands for solar. Same with the brown. These are ideal tracts. Those sites that are in the brownish orange, those are sites that are also in Virginia's map for high conservation value lands. So for us, this is really a shorthand map of like where you should not site it as well as where you should site it. Additionally, this does try to flag mine sites and brownfields, both of which are in that highest level of degraded soil. And we've yet to see a widespread adoption of siting solar on those sites. We haven't found the right incentive package yet, but we're hopeful we will. And then for the Bay world, what can we do to minimize water quality impacts? We have seen some unfortunate stormwater examples around the state. We have 5 notice of violations in Richmond County right now while we're sitting here. Not a great week. So there are some things that can be done that minimizes potential water quality impacts. So minimizing the grading. I'll come back to this all-terrain tracker in a second. Making sure you're limiting soil compaction or requiring decompaction at decommissioning. Topsoil retention. A lot of the sites we're scraping them in order to accommodate certain technologies, and they're essentially leaving bare fields that are then stormwater hazards for the surrounding areas. Requiring vegetative cover and more robust cover, and then a recent concept that has taken hold in a number of states is this idea of limiting how much of the site can be disturbed at a given time, because if say you're going to do a 6,000 acre project, previously you'd get a contractor to come in and they would clear 6,000 acres. You're not building on that, so you just have a ton of exposed land during that time. Real simple change is, chunking it up and saying like, okay, you're going to clear 500 acres at a time, and make sure you're working and covering it as you go. And we've seen this successfully implemented in other states. So these are not difficult things to do. They're really, in some sense, common sense, but we hope to see them adopted as industry practices. The terrain tracking joints, this is what they look like. The advantage they offer is you don't have to take away the topsoil, and you can work with the grade of the land. It allows essentially joints in the panels rather than needing a singular flat surface, which many of the design forms require. And so encouraging people to move to these terrain trackers would also minimize disturbance and potential stormwater issues. A lot of this, the state has already taken action on through updated stormwater guidance. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, and I already touched on limiting the total acreage. But again, Virginia's been very active on this the last couple of years. We think they've made positive progress, but there's still some more best practices that can be adopted. And we're going to do Q&A as a panel later. So thank you so much for letting me talk with you all for a bit. I'm going to introduce Angela. Oh, you come on up.
Here's the QR code for anyone just came in. Go ahead and scan that if you have any questions now. And thank you so much, Jay, for setting the stage. Jay has been in the weeds on this issue, I think negotiating bills until 11 p.m. or something insane like that. And so to be able to kind of give us the big picture is great. Really fortunate to have Angela Navarro next, and I think she's going to bring it up to the state level as well to kind of see how this, why there's so much movement in solar, why we're seeing those numbers grow, and where this fits into kind of where the Commonwealth has been heading and is headed. So let me get Angela's presentation up. So yeah, we're very fortunate to have Angela. Come on up, don't be shy. Angela served in the role of Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, as well as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Trade during Governor Ralph Northam's administration. Also, Commissioner of the State Corporation Commission from 2021 to 2022. Currently, she's focusing on advancing policy and initiatives that promote clean energy and combat climate change with the Virginia League of Conservation Voters, among other entities. So thank you so much. Look forward to hearing.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to go back one slide. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so I have my own law, policy, and regulatory affairs consulting firm, but I might take a little bit of a step back because Jay gave a little history of the move toward renewable energy in Virginia. And I've been working on this for about 16 years now. So I started my career at the Southern Environmental Law Center, leading their air and energy program in Virginia. And like Jay said, for many years, it was sort of hitting a brick wall in Richmond, trying to work through legislation, working through various executive actions to get more clean energy in Virginia. We were at the bottom of the 50 states. And then we started to see a little bit of movement in around 2015, 2016. And the reason we actually saw that movement is an interesting one, and one I'm sure we'll probably discuss, but it was because of large tech companies that were investing in renewable energy to meet their corporate sustainability targets. 10 years later, we're now having a lot of conversations around those tech companies and their energy needs. But I think it's interesting to note that 10 years ago, it was a lot of those companies that were starting to make those investments. Around that time, I went into the McAuliffe administration and served as Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources and got to lead our climate portfolio. And we started to think through what are the steps that we could take via executive action to try to promote opportunities around solar. So did as much as we could to work with our environmental permitting agencies to streamline those processes and make it a little easier to build solar through a permit by rule. We also worked with our legislature to start standing up some pilot programs. And then when Governor Northam came in, I moved over to Commerce and Trade, which is where the energy portfolio sat. And that's when we really took very significant action. Part of this was because our federal government at the time was removing itself from the Paris Agreement, and there were a group of states that were sort of leaning in, formed this climate alliance. And all of us collectively said, as states, we can take action to lead where our federal government isn't. And worked with a group of really strong legislators on a number of bills, but the most significant of which is the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And as Jay mentioned, that is the blessing, that is the reason why we have so much interest and so much development of renewable energy across the Commonwealth, solar, and because we're in Hampton Roads, offshore wind as well. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on what the Virginia Clean Economy Act is, because there are a couple of different pillars. And this sort of nationwide trend of moving toward a greater level of renewables that's obviously important in Virginia, but across the country. So I'm going to start with this chart, which this information comes from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which charts out sort of our transition on energy, electricity, how much we're paying for electricity. But I think this is a really interesting slide because it certainly shows, you'll see solar in yellow. Very small part of our electric grid in 2010, which is when we really started this concerted effort to increase the renewable generation in Virginia. And this is nationwide. Now you look at 2024, and 81% of the new capacity that was installed last year, again, nationwide, was from solar resources. So very, very significant growth. If you look at natural gas, which is that like little tiny gray slice down here, only 6% last year, which I think is interesting because certainly we've seen, very significant gas and coal historically. That's not to say we're out of the clear. There's certainly a lot of movement for more gas in the future. But as of this past year, we've seen a massive transition. But I'll talk about Virginia. There's a lot of words on this slide. You don't really need to pay attention to all those. I did try to bold the most important ones. So the Virginia Clean Economy Act is our statewide legislation that essentially says, how are we going to get from where we are now, or where we were in 2020, to this 100% renewable energy future? So for Dominion, which is our largest utility in Virginia, it's 100% renewable energy by 2045. For Appalachian Power, which is our second largest utility that covers a large swath of Southwest Virginia, it's 100% by 2050. And basically, the legislation has a lot of small targets to get to that level. So for example, 30% renewable energy by 2030. That's the next iterative target. And then there's a target for 2031, 2032. I didn't put all of those in here for you. But essentially, the utilities every single year have to have a plan in place to eventually reach these targets and to reach those interim targets. And when I was on the State Corporation Commission, they have to submit that plan to the commission for approval. So there is a thing, an entity that is making sure that our utilities are meeting those targets. And it's really important to note the second piece, because if they don't meet those targets, then they have to make a deficiency payment, which is like a penalty. And that deficiency payment is set at a level that the utilities are incentivized to invest in renewable energy. There's a lot of terms in the law that say things like how much can the utility own versus how much can third parties own. I don't think we need to get into that level of detail here today, but just understand that the utilities have a massive incentive to make this transition. There is a second piece of the legislation that is the actual building of these assets. So you have the target, which is we want to get to 100% renewable energy by 2045 and 2050. And how are we going to get there? So this was a pretty comprehensive negotiation over what those megawatts were. And Jay talked about, okay, for a certain number of megawatts, it's going to take, 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres or 100,000 acres. But what we're translating this to is how do we get that to that 100% clean energy future? And that's what these numbers were negotiated really amongst the parties to try to identify what did we need to build here in Virginia, recognizing that there might be some solar projects located in our neighboring states, but what do we need to build here in Virginia to get us on track toward meeting these targets? The numbers are pretty significant for Dominion. 16,100 megawatts of solar, and I'll put that in context on the next slide for you. Energy storage is another very significant resource because, as we know, the sun doesn't shine 24/7, but we need electricity 24/7, right? And so the theory behind energy storage is as that resource becomes more efficient, you'll be able to use storage to back up when the solar is not operating. And then 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind. We all know that there's a huge offshore wind facility under construction off the coast of Virginia right now that's about 2,600 megawatts. But there is a larger target beyond that 2,600 megawatts for Dominion. Appalachian Power is smaller. They have a much smaller service territory, and they're coming from a much smaller renewable penetration to begin with. So there's 600 megawatts of solar and offshore wind and 400 megawatts of energy storage. So again, let me put that in context for you. 16,100 megawatts of solar is enough solar to power 1.8 million homes. That's not all of Virginia, but it's a pretty significant swath. 2,600 megawatts of offshore wind, which is the current offshore wind facility under development here in Virginia that'll be operational next year, is enough to power 660,000 homes. So when you put those together, that's roughly 2.5 million Virginians that will be powered by clean energy, by non-emitting energy, which I think is pretty significant, and that is sort of the foundational layer of the Clean Economy Act. For Appalachian Power, as I said, it's a smaller number, but still 67,000 homes, which is really important, especially for that territory. So the Clean Economy Act is our most significant law. It sort of sets the tone for how Virginia is going to get to these 100% clean targets. I'm sure there's a lot more for us to discuss, but I just wanted to sort of set the foundation for where Virginia is. So with that, Christy, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
great questions are coming in. Thank you all. For our third, last but not least speaker, Casey Filippino. We're thrilled to have Casey. Casey's going to, I think, bring it a little bit to a more regional or local level. And for those of you who are here tonight because you want to say, what do I do with the solar salesman? I don't understand this. I think Casey is addressing on a regional scale some of those issues. Casey is a senior water resources planner at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. In her role, she focuses on water resource management and planning for the region, contributing to initiatives that address regional water issues and promote sustainable practices. Casey earned her PhD from Old Dominion University, focused on harmful algal blooms and local water quality. We have to put that because that's CBF loves that area of focus. More importantly, it's tonight Casey's 20th anniversary. Her husband was going to come, but I think at the last minute, he chose sports for her kids. So let's thank Casey for being here. Yours too?
Not 20 years, 9.
9 years. Okay, so the dedication here is unreal. So we're really lucky to have these speakers. Casey, if you want to come up and share a little bit about your marriage or solar in the region, either way.
Yes, I told him to stay home and do baseball. Well, thanks. Happy to be here. I'm really glad everybody got to set the stage because I think I'm going to try to bring it home and bring it to a little bit more of a scale of like, well, what can you do? And what are we doing? Because you'd be surprised, while there's some things happening in the region, they're not happening equally across each locality. So just a little background quickly. Oh, I should have gotten the, I touched buttons, Christy. I didn't know. Should I go this way? Okay. So yeah, if you're not familiar with the Planning District Commission, we actually are a regional entity. We are state created, locally enabled. There's 22 of us in the state. We're one of the largest in the state of Virginia. We actually work for 15 localities in the region, working on issues of local significance, but trying to elevate them at a regional level to really help localities have a level playing field if they're trying to work on state or federal issues. One of the issues that we're working on right now, one of the projects, is the Climate Action Plan. It is funded by EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. And you'll see the map on the left. It includes all 15 localities in Hampton Roads, but we've also brought in 3 localities or 3 counties in North Carolina. And we also have Matthews County there on the Middle Peninsula. So we are working on this plan. We've been working on it for a few years, and the goal is to essentially do a regional assessment of our greenhouse gas emissions, and we work with our EPA partners and their consultants to figure out how much greenhouse gases are we emitting in the region, and then figure out what we can do to mitigate those greenhouse gases. We are at the final stages of that plan. You may have seen a survey we put out earlier in the year. We'll be putting another survey out later this year. But essentially, we're trying to work in all these different sectors because we realize greenhouse gas emissions are coming from all over the place. Transportation, our natural and ag lands, solid waste, wastewater, industry. And then we have our grid scale energy and our building energy efficiency. Within those buckets, solar is a key part of these recommendations that we're going to be moving forward at the end of this year when our plan is actually due. We're working with a steering committee, which is made up of representatives from local governments. We have stakeholders from Dominion, from the port, larger, we have the Sierra Club, other local nonprofits, all kinds of people from all over the region are trying to help us develop this plan, and we are vetting all of these recommendations through that steering committee. So with that said, I'm only going to focus on solar. I could talk all day long about all the other recommendations. I think we're up to about 30 total, and it is still a work in progress. So in terms of solar, we got all of our stakeholders together over the past few years, and we've been discussing what the issues are. In terms of how our local governments are helping our residents provide opportunities for solar, we realize that not everybody's doing it the same way. Norfolk's doing a great job, and I can say that I'm from Norfolk. But Norfolk's doing a great job. They have a website, they've got a solar co-op, they're doing all kinds of things, but maybe somebody like Portsmouth or Pocosin, they don't have those opportunities. They don't have those staff to help them make that, have those kinds of incentives or programs on solar. So we realized really quickly that some localities are doing it right, some localities don't have anything at all. And so they're very decentralized. There's too much information in too many places out there. I'm sure you're familiar with that. You can find information about solar everywhere, but you don't know what's good, what's bad. Like I said, localities are each running something slightly different. And we've learned quickly that not all co-ops are the same. There's also a lack of trust by residents and localities and solar programs and installers. We've heard many, many stories of people just not being sure of somebody who's knocking on their door, what that means, what the quality of the service is going to be, if they can really trust this provider. And there's also a lack of trust in funding and what can be used for what purpose, more of like a lack of understanding. And also community types vary, right? So we have historical homes, aging roofs, multifamily buildings. How are we going to install solar? How are we going to reach those goals that Angela talked about? How are we going to get there when we know that everything's different? And in Hampton Roads, we really realized that this was the perfect opportunity to work together because all of our localities want to do something, but they just don't have the ability to do it. So we have several proposed regional recommendations. And I'm just going to go through some of these, and I have some examples, and then hopefully some of this might connect you to some things that you can actually do. The first thing we want to do is share. We want to try to be a regional solar hub. And that can be as simple as a website that we host at the PDC that localities can point to, so they don't actually have to manage it. A knowledge center. We can provide mapping tools. Where are these installs happening? What are the viabilities or the roof potentials? There can be links to incentive programs, resources, policy decisions. And this isn't like, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. There are examples of this in the state, so I'll talk to those briefly. So we're not going to be reinventing the wheel here. We can streamline. So there's lots of programs out there that allow us to streamline and adopt best practices, and some of our localities are already doing that. Norfolk is a Soul Smart Gold, so they have achieved gold in their local recognition program. And all that's doing is helping residents who want to get permitted for solar have a streamlined permitting process. Everything's all in one place. It's very simple and it's very easy. And so they can work towards that, bronze, silver, gold. And it's just elevating the programs that are going to work for everybody. And finally, we want to connect. We've learned of a lot of partners across the state that are nonprofits that are really doing great work to support solar growth. And so that's considering those solar co-ops, and I'll talk about those in a minute, allowing us to vet solar companies so that there's no more distrust and we can demystify those solar installations, and then participating in some of the annual campaigns which are actually happening right now. With that, these are those examples I was talking about. So Northern Virginia and Charlottesville, both are part of the Solarize program. It is run by Local Energy Alliance program, and we spoke to these folks, and they're amazing. They're a nonprofit that will host that solar hub, that will help you brand the materials so that we can have a solarized Hampton Roads, we can have a solarized Norfolk, we can have a solarized Poquoson. And they're actually doing that right now for localities. You can go ahead and sign up. Their campaign is running through July 15th, actually. We haven't officially organized anything. This is just one of our recommendations, but we can make this a little bit more official by working with our regional commission and helping all the localities get lifted up with this program. There's also Solar United Neighbors. There's a Solar United Neighbors Hampton Roads on their website. You can also go up and sign up right now too. I think the last day is Friday to get more information. But Norfolk uses Solar United Neighbors, and that's an official co-op for putting solar on your house. And they essentially just help you put everything in one place and develop resources for homeowners. They do free solar site assessments, allow for discounted pricing, and affordable financing. And then this gives you your qualified installers, so there's no guesswork. They bring in all the right people. And then they provide community workshops and offer support. What I think is cool and what I think we could do at HRPDC, at NVRC, or the Northern Virginia Regional Commission on their hub, they have a map of solar potential. They also have how much carbon dioxide has been drawn down, how much greenhouse gas emissions have been averted. And so you can show all kinds of information on that solar hub. And so that's something that we can do, and we're really recommending that to our steering committee for approval. So moving forward, we're working on vetting these actions with our steering committee. We're researching what works. We're working with LEAP, Solarize Virginia, Solar United Neighbors, and anybody else that comes up. We're evaluating all the policy that Angela was talking about. There's been some stuff happening about net metering that I'm concerning, if you're going to be putting solar on your house. Continuing to support the tax credits that are out there and still available, and looking for other incentives. And one thing I didn't mention, and this touches a little bit about what Jay started with, we're not just talking about residential solar either in this plan. This is just what I wanted to share today. We're also trying to work with localities to lead by example. So that means putting solar on your government buildings, on your government facilities, in your parks, in your public spaces, on school buildings, helping them understand what incentives they can find and use to also put solar or go green in any way they can, but for these purposes. And then also thinking about those parking deck arrays and thinking about creative ways to use our brownfields to put in solar. We have a lot of developed land here in Hampton Roads. We're not going to be seeing so many solar arrays and farm fields, aside from some of those outer counties. So really being creative about where local governments can lead in putting forth their solar effort. So with that, this is a QR code. I know there's a lot of QR codes today to our plan. Well, actually, it's to our website. And you can learn more about our plan as a whole. And there is an opportunity to comment and send us comments. We will be sending out a survey come June, which will actually have all of our draft actions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And you can use that survey to rank well, we haven't developed it yet, but we'll be ranking all of the recommendations that we will have. And then the plan will be final and going to our commission this fall, and then final by the end of the year. So that's all I have.
Ask the panelists to come up to the table. I'll give them a 30-second warning too, that if the panelists have thoughts in reflection of the other speakers, happy to give you the mic to share those as well. We've got some great questions, but if there's anything that you want to share. Okay. Anything to add? Jump into questions. And I saw some folks taking pictures of the slides. We can send out these slides tonight. So feel free to, don't feel like you have to memorize everything. I'll probably actually send them out tomorrow to the folks that registered.
So you ready for questions?
Yeah, we actually have a QR code if you want to.
Yeah. So I'm going to add one little thing. So Casey asked me to talk a little bit about net metering. Do you guys know what net metering is? Some, yeah, sort of. Okay, well, let me just start by saying what net metering is, and then I'll talk a little bit about the current status of net metering, because there are some potential threats to the program paired with rollbacks in the federal tax credits that could make it much harder to go solar if that's what you choose to do. So net metering is a program. It's been in place in Virginia for about 13, 14 years. And what it does is it allows individual businesses, your church, your school, to install solar on site and to offset your utility bill 1-to-1. Your retail rate is reduced by the solar that is produced on your site, okay? And it's a really great investment. It usually takes, 5 to 7 years to pay off, or to get the payback for that investment. But over the long term, of course, you're providing resiliency on your site, you're reducing your electricity bills, and if you produce extra energy on site, it's sold back to the utility at their cost. So that's how net metering works. It's a program that's in place in lots and lots of states around the country. And it's usually the kind of foundational, we call it distributed energy resource, which means these smaller resources that are located in your community. It's sort of the foundational program. And it was expanded as part of the Virginia Clean Economy Act so that you could have a larger percentage of our grid be net metered, and also you could have larger installations. So now you can go up to, I believe, 3 megawatts in size can be net metered. So by legislation a couple of years ago, the utilities, both Dominion and Appalachian Power, are required to file their plans. So we're going through Appalachian Power's first to update how much they'll pay you for the solar that you are producing on your home. And the theory behind this is that if you are producing solar on site and it's alleviating 100% of your utility bill, then you are not paying your fair share of the grid. You'll need to use the grid for the periods when your solar isn't producing. So that's sort of the theory behind this recalculation. And what we've seen, at least from Appalachian Power, we haven't seen Dominion's proposal, is a very, very significant reduction on what you would get paid for the solar that you're producing to offset your utility bill. And that will make it very difficult. The economics much harder to decide to make that investment. Certainly paired with what we saw this week that may or may not become finalized out of Congress with the rollbacks of the federal tax credits for community energy resources, including rooftop solar, it would just make it very difficult to see rooftop solar be a thriving, significant part of the pathway to achieving our Clean Economy Act goals. So I think it's important to just sort of contextualize, Jay talked a lot about the large scale solar projects and some of the considerations of the conversion of farmland and mitigation. But the other side is the distributed solar, which is, what we as individuals have the ability to sort of think through that investment in our own lives. And that is also something that we're starting to see some pretty significant challenges here in Virginia.
Great. I wanted to, one of the questions the audience asked, a little bit similar, is how does residential solar help the renewable energy broader portfolio and goals?
So, really great question. I didn't go into as much detail as I typically do because there are so many numbers in the Clean Economy Act. It's a 65-page bill, so those little snippets that I pulled out are just kind of the high levels. But there's sort of two sides to the Clean Economy Act. There's the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is the 100% by 2045 for Dominion, 100% by 2050 for Appalachian Power. Dominion right now is required to achieve 1% of that 100% target with distributed energy resources. So it's a pretty small portion. There's been legislation over the last couple of years, including this session, it passed both chambers to increase that up to 6%. So you have a larger share of the RPS that would be achieved by distributed energy resources. So that is something to consider. Then on the build target side, there is language that basically designates 1,100 megawatts of distributed energy resources. So you could sort of think of that as, of the 16,100 megawatts in total that will come from solar, 1,100 megawatts from distributed energy. So I'm not a mathematician. I wish I could do that at the top of my head. But it's again, a fraction of the total.
Jay, you want to add him? Also, somewhat along the same lines, and these questions were asked earlier in the presentation, so we may have covered it a little bit. But from the, I think, Angela, you showed a slide of, say 1.6 million homes is what solar would provide from Dominion. Where are those homes getting powered by solar? Where's the greatest need? DC, Richmond, western part of the state, where can we benefit? Kind of thinking not as distributed solar, but from this larger scale generation, where is it going to and where do we want it to go to? A little bit of the geography and how it ties in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. We don't choose where the electrons go, right? They just flow through the grid. We certainly have price signals on where you have capacity constrained areas like Northern Virginia, where there's a lot of data centers. And the idea would be when the prices are very high there that you would see more capacity go to those places like solar. So the idea really from the market perspective is, okay, if you have a constraint, it should show up by a higher price. And that higher price should mean that is where you want to locate a resource if you're a capitalist, right? Like, because you're going to get a higher price for that resource. That isn't always what happens. And to Jay's point, a lot of these solar assets are located in rural areas primarily because that's where the land is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're located right next to population centers. There's transmission build out and a lot of transmission build out that needs to continue to happen to provide the electrons from those rural areas to our urban cores. And historically, that's sort of how our electricity system has operated, right? You have these large centralized power plants that are located outside of cities, and then you have transmission lines and distribution system lines that connect them to households. That's sort of still where we are. The interesting thing around the conversation on distributed energy resources, which was what I talked about with net metering and some of the programs that Casey mentioned, is that now you can have those assets located in your urban core, so you don't lose electrons to those lines, right? They call it line losses when you're electrons over very large distances. And you can actually have power located in your community, whether that's on a house, a school, a church, a hospital, a parking lot, a landfill. And we're seeing more and more of those types of installations. Is there enough to power an entire city right now? No, absolutely not. But I think the goal over time is that more of those rooftop solar and storage and microgrid assets can start to be located in communities and within communities and help to alleviate the strain on the rural geographies and the need for more transmission.
And earlier on the slide of things that we heard from stakeholders, I kind of glazed over this idea of energy burden fairness, but this came up a lot, and Angela did an excellent job of explaining why it doesn't work like that. But there is sort of this misconception, I think, sometimes that everyone should produce the energy they're using, and not only is that like impossible from a scientific standpoint, but it's just not how our energy grid works. But there was a lot of pushback from legislators in some of our rural counties that said, I am being asked to shoulder the burden for energy production in Northern Virginia, and to the point about distributed, I think there's widespread excitement about expanding distributed. But one of the things we heard a lot over the last year from stakeholders, particularly from rural counties, was, my county has 10,000 acres of solar, and it used to be farmland. And I go to Tyson's Corner and I will not see a solar panel anywhere in Northern Virginia. And this, again, I don't think it's a helpful framing tool, but that's not how the General Assembly works. Sometimes just live off of perceptions. And so it's important that we acknowledge that was a big driver in this dichotomy about solar siting fights, is the perceived fairness of where things are going to be located. And it's not a non-issue. It's something that does need to be discussed about what just distribution looks like as we continue to build out. But it is a sore spot for a lot of our rural localities right now.
We have a few questions on tax credits and which ones we're losing, how that might affect goals. Also, if we could add, is where do people get information on tax credits? If there are some changes, do people need to act fast? So tax credit 101, I think, is on people's mind.
Specifically, but I think that's some of the advice that I've been hearing is, act fast. And I'm sure you can fill the gap in on that one. But I think that's another thing that we'd like to be able to post that information because it's evolving so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, number one is there's no final decision on what the rollback of energy tax credits will be. There's some people have likened it to an opening pitch, which came out of Ways and Means earlier this week out of Congress. I think, there are a lot of great resources out there. The Solar Energy Industries Association has a really good resource that sort of just digests what that Ways and Means markup has in it. Whether that becomes the final version or not, nobody has a crystal ball, right? And what the House says doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the Senate's going to go along with. And so I'm not a federal lobbyist, but certainly have lots of conversations with my clients around what this means. Some of these tax credits, like the community energy credit, which is the credit that you would use for rooftop solar, under the markup would phase out by the end of this year. So if you are thinking about going solar at your own home or business, that is an indication, at least, that Congress is entertaining phasing that tax credit out by the end of this year. There are other tax credits, like the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, which more apply to the larger scale assets that are phased out more gradually, not in 2025, but over time. I think it's also worth noting that it's not just solar tax credits, but it's other types of tax credits, including for energy efficient appliances and home weatherization, and the whole energy efficiency sort of tax credit structure is also, at least in the proposal, going to be phased out. So certainly worth looking at some of the resources to see like. But again, it's an opening pitch. It's not the final decision, and I don't know that we'll necessarily have that for a couple of months.
And the best place to find some of those resources?
Oh yeah,
or
so I
clearance?
said the Solar Energy Industries Association has a good resource. I know we work with other local groups like Advanced Energy United has a big presence in Virginia, and they do some of this analysis. You can find this information probably in both of those places.
I'm going to ask one last question, and if the speakers want to wrap up with anything, we can have time for that as well. This last question actually is 3 questions. A very strategic Mentimeter user. I don't know who you are, but there's a few in here. What are renewable energy certificates? Does going 100% renewable mean the closing of the 2 nuclear power plants and 6 coal plants in Virginia? And how will we meet demands of the new data centers in Virginia? So we might be here till 11 p.m., but good questions.
All right. Well, let's just go. Okay. So, I'll go through them, and then you guys, I'm sure, have things to say about this. So, renewable energy certificates are essentially the thing that represents 1 kilowatt hour of production of renewables. So, or megawatt hour, depending. It's basically the thing that says this is how much renewable energy you are producing. So if you're a rooftop solar asset, it's typically measured in kilowatt hours. If you're a big utility scale asset, it's typically measured in megawatt hours. And for the utility, they have to purchase these. They have to purchase renewable energy certificates, and they have to retire them, which means that they cannot be resold to anybody else in order to meet their renewable energy requirements. And I didn't go into this in my presentation, but I think it's important to note that the target of 100% renewable energy by 2045 doesn't mean that we won't have other resources in Virginia. It just means that if you're producing from those other resources, you have to purchase renewable energy certificates to cover the generation from those resources. So I think that's a really important distinction. There is other language in the Clean Economy Act that requires the retirement of coal plants under the timeline that we move to 100% renewable energy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we will have no fossil fuel production in 2045 or 2050. So that's really important. The question around nuclear. So when we were in the process of negotiating the Clean Economy Act, nuclear was a big part of that conversation because 40% of our electricity in Virginia that's produced in the Commonwealth of Virginia comes from nuclear generation at Surrey and North Anna. And so there's this big question of where does that generation fit? Because it's not carbon emitting, but it's also not renewable. And some states decided that they were going to create a broader framework that was 0 emitting credits and not just renewable energy credits. And they captured nuclear in that framework. In Virginia, we actually excluded nuclear from our renewable portfolio standard framework. So basically what that means is we have to get to 100% of our non-nuclear energy by 2045 or 2050. And so we just carve out nuclear. And basically, if Dominion gets their relicensing for North Anna or Surrey, units will continue to operate and they'll continue to be carved out. And so you don't have to purchase energy certificates to cover that generation. If those units retire, then we have to produce a whole lot more solar and wind and other renewable energy resources to meet the energy requirements of our state, that 40% that would no longer come from nuclear. Okay, so that's question number 2. Question number 3 on data centers. So when we negotiated the Clean Economy Act, we knew that data centers were already in Virginia. It was actually a pretty significant part of Dominion's load forecast. With 80% of their load was projected at the time to come from data centers. So we knew data centers were already here and that they were going to continue to grow. Since that time, obviously, it's exploded. AI, machine learning, we read about it in the news every single day. So when you look at the numbers like 16,100 megawatts of solar, we could have 16,100 megawatts from data centers alone, right? We're at about 5,000 megawatts right now in Virginia, maybe a little bit more than that. But it's not infeasible to imagine that within the next couple of years, 5, 8 years, we would get to that 16,100 megawatts. And so there are a couple of things that we tried to future-proof in the Clean Economy Act around data center growth. That's not to say it's perfect, and there will probably need to be some tweaks in the future. which Jay will have to work on because he's still doing legislative work. I no longer do that anymore. But one of the things that we try to do to future-proof this is we created a program called Accelerated Renewable Energy Buyer. And basically what that is these like very, very large energy customers, which are essentially the data centers. They could procure renewables or renewable energy certificates and retire them for their own load so that you and I aren't paying for those RECs to serve their load. And that reduces Dominion's obligations too. So that's one way, is that they can just go ahead and procure their own renewables offset at the same or greater thresholds for our renewable portfolio standard. So they don't make it more difficult to meet our renewable portfolio standard, but they have their own mechanism to do this, which no other customer really has that same mechanism to do. So that's one. The other is that these large customers can shop competitively, which means they don't actually have to purchase their electricity from Dominion like you or I do. They have the alternative to purchase from a third party. And that was preserved in the Clean Economy Act. And that is also another mechanism for these energy intensive industries to purchase electricity outside of Dominion's footprint. Those third parties still have to meet the RPS requirements. They just pay Dominion to do that. So they're essentially offsetting Dominion's requirements as well. So those are two ways that we, again, tried to future-proof it. I work a lot on data center issues across the country, and there's a lot of, sort of market innovations around how we meet the energy demands of the data centers, but I don't think anybody necessarily has all the solutions. I do think that the next probably 2 to 3 years, we'll see a lot of conversation in Richmond around what types of policy reforms we'll need to make so that we can continue to meet the Clean Economy Act targets and not move backward away from those goals.
I was going to just make a final statement here for myself because I'm personally learning a lot. This is not, if you've noticed, this is not something that local governments can really grasp on a regular basis. That if they don't have a sustainability officer, understanding all of these nuances of solar and energy in general is just quite a challenge. So I'm hopeful that we forward with the plan to be that hub for them. But also something that Jay said earlier got me thinking about the disparity in terms of rural versus urban. And one way that I think helping us move forward is to provide those resources to understand the differences between what you're getting, in those larger solar arrays on farm fields versus how we can move forward with actually consolidating in our developed areas. And we haven't figured that out yet. We don't do that well, at least not in Hampton Roads that I've seen, is getting those rooftop solar on larger facilities, commercial things, being really innovative approaches and having the tools in the toolbox to be able to do that for local governments isn't quite there yet. And so personally, I'd like to see that move forward at a local or regional scale so that we can start alleviating some of those concerns in those two spaces so that Jay's job isn't so hard in the legislature.
On the topic of data centers, as the environmental NGO obligated to say something, which is, look, the tough issue here, at least from an environmental standpoint, is that the speed at which these facilities are coming online is stressing the speed at which we can deploy new energy production resources. We've got a bit of a math problem. And I think while there's going to be a lot of conversation about this in the legislature in the coming years, I think where we are going to fall is the solution can't be, to what Angela alluded to go backwards, which is we're already seeing proposals out of the regulated community saying the solution is to let us build 6 new gas plants. And that's how we're going to be able to keep pace with this. And, that's a line, it's going to be a line in the sand for us and many in the NGO community to say we have made so much progress. We cannot have new construction start to go backwards into natural gas. I loved Angela's chart where it showed what a small percentage we were at in natural gas at this point. I don't want that to blow back up as a result of the speed at which we're deploying these facilities. And so that's going to be the crux of the negotiation, at least from the environmental NGO community, is how do we balance what is a huge economic driver in this state with keeping the positive trajectory that we've been on in clean energy.
Thank you. Please join me in giving a round of applause to the speakers.